Painting a beach background is easier than you think, and I'm going to show you exactly how you can do it. Hello wonderful people, it's Genevieve, and my goal here on this channel is to teach you all about illustration and design. So if you're new, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of the weekly videos, and so that you can join our wonderful creative community. And with that said, grab your drawing tools, and let's get started. A few quick notes before we start. This video is a hybrid between a step-by-step drawing tutorial as well as a draw with me, in the sense that yes, I'm going to show you how to draw all the different elements, but the main goal is for you to draw your own scene. Another quick note is that I will be drawing in an app on the iPad called Procreate, but this video is really not about any specific or fancy features that come within the app, so you can follow along with pretty much any other software that you have. Photoshop, Ibis Paint, Clip Studio, all of those could definitely work. But if you are working with Procreate and if you want to have my illustration as a reference like this, the way to do that is going in the wrench icon menu at the top. In the Canvas submenu, activating this reference toggle here, which is going to let you import an image. Now you can download my illustration along with the color palette that we'll be using in this video. They are both linked in the description below and they're totally free. So we're simply going to start with a very rough sketch just to map out the main elements. So go ahead and create a new layer and rename this layer to Sketch. Now you can sketch with really any color of your choice because we're not going to see the sketch in the final result. I personally like to use just a neutral gray, but again, whatever you like and you're comfortable with could totally work. And in this video, I'm always going to suggest a few different brushes. I'm going to suggest free brushes that come with Procreate and you can really use and get great results with. I'm also going to suggest a few options if you are working in a different software, not necessarily options, but I'm going to give you tips on finding brushes that could work well as well. And I'm also going to suggest brushes from my illustration bundle. Now the last background video that I did, I used the inking brushes. Now I'm going to use a slightly different pack just to show you that honestly, finding a brush that you like is more important than using a specific brush. So that means it could be a free brush, it could be a brush from a different pack, or it could be a brush from some of my pack. So if you do want to check out my illustration bundle, it will be linked in the description below, and there's always a special promo code for the YouTube people. But again, it's really not essential, especially not for a background like this. And especially for the sketch, because again, we're not going to see the sketch in the final result, so just pick something you know you're comfortable with. If you're working with free brushes that come with Procreate, it could be, for example, in the sketching pack, the HB pencil. If you're working in a different software, anything that you're comfortable with, again, I know I'm repeating myself, but that's super important, or a brush that has pencil in the name would probably work really well. If you are working with my illustration bundle though, you could pick the sketching brush, of course, that kind of makes sense. And we're simply going to start by zooming out so that we can see the edges of the canvas, so that we can really see what we're working with when we're creating our composition. Now in general, when you're drawing a background, especially a landscape, you want to start by placing the horizon line. Now the decision of where to put this line really just depends on what you want the main focus to be in your piece. Now in my case, I want the beach and the water to be the main focus, so I'm going to make sure that my land part, so the bottom part, is thicker. But I still want to see a bit of sky because I want to be able to play with the clouds. So now that you have this line mapped out, the next goal is going to be to add some depth in your background, and for that we're going to add a few different plans. So in this case, I'm just going to start by mapping out roughly where the water ends and where the sand starts. Now this shape can really be whatever you want. You could draw a lagoon, you could draw a big ocean, you could draw a straight beach. I'm going to go with something quite flowy and organic. Now having this line, this vertical section here, already helps inform the depth of the piece simply because of the fact it's vertical and it's going away. Now we're going to reinforce that depth idea even more by adding something further in the back. And in this beach, I'm going for something super natural, tropical, kind of wild. So I'm going to add some rough rock mountains things in the back. But you could draw something else. If you wanted it to be a bit more urban, you could even draw a skyline in the back. You could add a bit of a boat. Really whatever you need depending on what you want the vibe of your piece to be. But I do recommend drawing something in the very, very back. In the opposite, we're also going to add something way in the front. And just to kind of bring the piece together and help frame it, I'm essentially going to repeat what is way far back and add some rocks in the front. But once more, this is something that you can totally adapt to whatever beach situation you have. And essentially then all you have to do is just add something between the front and the back just to make it a little bit less boring. And I don't know about you, but for a beach, I automatically think I need some palm trees. And you can put them wherever you want. I'm gonna go with a big one on this side to make it look like it's close to us. So just mapping out a slightly curved trunk. And then some big leaves. Now a trick for drawing palm tree leaves, at least a trick that I personally like, is drawing one big section and then having it fold towards the middle and then just finishing the section with a slightly different angled triangle. And in any kind of plant that you're drawing, one tip is to make sure that some of your leaves are overlapping, so you don't want them to be all perfectly separate. That's just going to look really unnatural and super weird. So just overlapping the different leaves, overlapping them with the trunk, that's going to really help make whatever kind of plant or tree that you're drawing look just more interesting and more natural and less kind of out of place. And one trick here that is pretty much general to whatever kind of composition you're working with, whenever you add an element, try to add an odd number of it. That is just going to help you have a better composition overall. You can see it's pretty much what I did with the rocks and the mountains. In the front I have 3 rocks and then in the back I have 3 mountains. And it seems like I always work in groups of 3, but it could be 1, 3, 5, 7, any odd number would work well. So quickly here I'm just going to finish up my sketch by adding a few more palm trees in the back. So take all the time you need here to roughly map out your composition. Again, it can be super messy and you can move stuff around. You know, once you have your composition, once you've sketched everything, you could use a tool like the selection tool, setting it to freehand and then drawing a selection around anything that you would like to move. I'm quite happy with what I have, but just to show you an example, I could select this rock right here and then with the arrow tool just move it around, maybe resize it a bit. So really take all the time you need here to not create a clean sketch, but create a sketch that you know would work well in terms of composition so that we can move on to the next phase, which is going to be adding the colors. Great, so once you have your rough sketch, we're going to start mapping out the colors pretty quickly. But before that, it might be helpful to change the blending mode of your sketch to multiply. So if you're working in Procreate, you can just tap on the little N right here next to the check mark and select multiply, which should be at the top. Now multiply is what is called a blending mode, and most software do have blending modes, so usually it's in the same area that you'd find opacity. That being said, it's definitely not essential. It's just going to help us see the sketch better on the colors that we draw below it. And having multiply, that means we can also lower the opacity of the sketch because we're still going to be able to see it well. It's going to adapt to the colors underneath. So we're going to lower it until we can just barely see it so that it's not too distracting when we start adding the colors. Now speaking of adding the colors, when I'm working on a background that has both sky and water, I usually start by setting my sky color. So that's exactly what we're going to do. Now if you're working in Procreate, you can just select your background color layer and set that. Otherwise, if you're working in a different software, just create a new layer and put it below your sketch layer. And here you can use really any kind of color you want for your sky, depending on the time of day as well as just the general weather. I want my beach scene to look very sunny and warm, so I'm going to go with a nice bright light blue, which as you can see here is pretty much middle of the way in terms of saturation, but is almost the brightest it can be. Now the reason I usually start with my sky whenever I'm drawing in a piece that has some water, just like the river background that we painted a few weeks ago, is that the sky is usually going to be the same or very similar color to the water because the body of water is going to be a reflection of the sky essentially. Now here in this piece, I'm going to cheat the watercolor a little bit, otherwise I think it's going to be just too big of a one colored blob, and also because this body of water we can imagine might not be super deep, so we could also see the sand, which is quite yellow, through the water, which would affect the color of the water. So all of that to say, we're going to create a new layer below the sketch. We're going to rename it to water, and on this water layer we're going to go with more of a greenish version of whatever sky color we used. So in my case, again, I used this blue right here. So for the water, I'm just going to add a bit of green to it and call it a day. Now, to be coherent with the color palette I'm providing, I'm going to use the one, again, from the color palette, which is going to be this one right here. But as you can see, it's just a greener version of the blue that we used. And here in terms of brushes, again, you have all the options of the world depending on the vibe that you want in your piece. I'm going to go with something that has some texture and a bit of grit. So if you're working with free brushes that come with Procreate, that could mean using, again, in the sketching pack, this time the 6B pencil. Or if you're working in a different software, just again, any brush that has pencil in the name is probably going to be good. If you are working with my illustration bundle though, for most of this piece, I'm going to use the everything brush, which like the name says, is really good for pretty much everything. And whichever brush that you have, we're going to use it to outline the shape of the water and then create a solid silhouette. So we're just going to repeat these two steps of outlining a color and then filling it in for all the different colors, and we're going to do that on separate layers. So essentially we're just going to take the time to color block everything, and then we're going to come back in, add some details, some lights, some shadows and stuff like that. So for now, we're just going to create a new layer for the sand. Now the sand is going to be below the water, so we're going to create the layer and put it under the water layer. And we're going to rename it to sand. Now for the sand color, obviously you can pick whatever you want depending on what kind of beach you want. You could have super white sand, you could have gray sand. I personally want my sand to be yellow, so I'm going to use this one right here in the color palette. Again, you can see it's quite bright and pretty much middle of the way in terms of saturation. Now one tip, if you are working with Procreate and you're struggling building a color palette and you're not using mine, what you can do at this stage is color pick either your sky or your watercolor, and then going in the harmony panel and playing with the different color harmonies that you have. So you see here I get a suggestion for some sort of a yellowish color, and then you can go back in classic, and without changing the hue, so without changing what we usually call the color, you can play with the brightness and the saturation and find a sand color. So by doing that, you are sure that your sand is going to work well with at least the sky or the water. That way you can ensure your palette is going to be coherent. Otherwise, you can just pick whatever color you want, or if you're using the color palette and you're following along, we're going to use this one right here. And same thing, we're just going to color block the shape. Now I'm going to give you tips on how to pick colors for the rest and how to color block everything. If you're not into that, if you just want to do it on your own, that's totally okay. You can skip to the next chapter in which we're going to start adding details and textures, and later we're going to add shadows. So once you have your sand and water, we're going to add the other elements. Now, no matter what elements they are, one thing to keep in mind is that the closer they are to us, the darker and the more saturated they are going to be. And inversely, the further away they are, the lighter and the less saturated they're going to be. So here I'm going to start with the rocks in the very front. So I'm just going to create a new layer above the water, and I'm going to rename this layer to rocks. Again, you can have whatever color you want for your rocks. I'm going to go with a really nice dark blue, and the color palette, it's this one right here. Again, you can see pretty much middle of the way in terms of saturation, but otherwise it's really quite dark. And since we have this color selected already for the rocks, we can imagine that the mountains in the background would be made of similar material, which means they would use the same base color. But again, if we remember, these rocks are way further away, which means they would be a lighter and less saturated version of this blue right here. So you could just go ahead and make it lighter and less saturated. But if you're working with the color palette, it's going to be this blue right here. Now the mountains are behind the water and behind the sand, so we're just going to create a new layer, put it below the water, put it below the sand, and rename it to mountains. Next, we're going to draw the palm trees, and I like to draw them on separate layer, meaning the front one on one layer and then the back one on one layer together. So we're going to create a new layer between the rocks and the water, and we're going to rename it to palm tree. Now again, you can pick whatever color you want, and if you're working with Procreate, you can use the Harmony tool to help you pick a brown and a green. But if you're working with the color palette, we're going to start with the trunk, which is going to be this kind of greenish brown right here. And then we're going to pick a brighter green for the leaves. So again, the color palette is going to be this one right here. And with that, it is time for the secret password. So if you've watched this far in the video, please go ahead and let me know in the comments how many palm trees you have in your illustration. Now, if you're new on the channel, you might be a little bit confused with what is this secret password thing. It's a game that we play here on the channel. In all the illustration videos that I post, I hide a secret word for you to find. And that does a few things. The first thing is, it's just really nice because you know me. You see my face in the intro, you hear my voice throughout the entire video, but I have no idea who you are. And whenever you leave a comment, no matter what the comment is, I get to sometimes see your face, sometimes see your name. And it's just so great to see who's part of the creative community that we're building here on the channel. So that's one reason why I do the secret password. The second reason is that it does give me a lot of insight into how to edit and pace my videos better, which helps me create better tutorials for you guys. And you know, that's what we all want in the end here, just the best content possible on this channel. So just leave a comment with how many palm trees you have in your illustration, and then we're going to keep going. Now, same thing for the palm trees in the back, but this time on a separate layer, just so we can move them around easily if we need to. This layer, we're going to put it below the palm tree above the water, and we're going to rename it to either palm trees, but with an S, or palm trees in the back, just something you will remember. And once more, we're just going to go with lighter, less saturated version of the main colors. So I'm going to use the two right here in the color palette. It really doesn't matter that much, honestly. Awesome, so now that we have all the main elements mapped out, you could go ahead and hide the sketch, and we're going to keep color blocking a few things before moving on to adding details and shadows, mostly the clouds, if you want any clouds, as well as kind of the foam at the end of water. And we're going to start with the clouds, so you can just create a new layer below everything, but above your background color, so below the mountains, and rename it to clouds. And for the clouds, you might be tempted to go with a pure white, but I would suggest avoiding that because that would bring a lot of attention to the clouds, and we really don't want the focus of the piece to be the clouds. Well, maybe you want, but I personally don't. So instead, just pick a kind of a dirty cream color, so something very, very bright, but that might have a little bit of gray to it. And then again, just like we did before, but maybe with a slightly bigger brush, you can just go in and map out the clouds. And here you really don't need to have anything super precise. The idea of adding clouds is just to make the sky look a little bit more interesting and less like one big blue thing. So it really doesn't need to be fancy, it doesn't need to be precise. Just add a few blobs here and there, and that's pretty much all you need to do. And the last thing we have to color block before adding some details and shadows is the foam on the water. So for that, we're going to create a new layer right above the water and rename it to foam. And you can use the same color you use for your clouds, but probably this time with a smaller brush. And here there's really no right or wrong way to draw this foam. I like to start by just outlining most of the wave, at least the part that is closer to us. And from there, just thicken in some areas, as well as adding a few bubbles here and there. And just to break up the water even more, it might be a good idea to add a second wave coming in, so using the same technique and just adding a few more white spots further into the water. Great, so we're almost done. Now it's just time to make this look a little bit less flat and boring by adding some details and some shading. And when I say detail, again, we're not going to add a whole lot because this would be a background, but we still want to make sure the elements in the front especially do look a little bit more detailed than they do right now. So for that, we're going to create a new layer above everything that we have, and we're going to rename it to Details. And there are so many different ways you could add details. I'm going to show you how I do it, but if you want to do it differently, of course, please do that. But essentially, I'm just going to color pick the different colors of my different elements in the foreground and then make those darker and just outline a few things. For example, here, the leaves that are overlapping each other. Since they're in the foreground, I want to make sure that they look detailed and they look separate. So I would, for example, add a line there. Now to do that, you can really use any brush of your choice. If you're working with the free brushes in Procreate, you could honestly stick to the 6B pencil from the sketching pack. That's what I would recommend. Same thing if you're working with a different software, just whatever brush you've been using for either your sketch or your colors probably is going to work here. Again, we're not looking for anything fancy, just something that you know you're comfortable with. But if you're working with the illustration bundle, you might want to switch to the outline brush. And then yeah, it's pretty simple. Without fully outlining everything, just adding a few lines to either show texture in the leaves, for example, or to help separate different elements that are overlapping and that are in the foreground, like again, these leaves right here. Now here I'm going to stop talking to let you focus on adding your details, but I'm going to keep my video going in the background so you can use it as a reference. Once more, you can copy exactly what I'm doing, or you could do it on your own. And once you have the details, we're going to meet up in the next step, which is going to be adding some color variations and shadows. Okay, so now we have everything, we have the details, but this piece still looks very flat, so we're just going to add some color variation and a tiny little bit of shading to really make it pop and make it look good. And we're going to start by just adding a gradient in the sky. So for that, we're just going to create a new layer, and we're going to put that layer below everything, but above the sky, of course, so below the clouds. And we're going to rename this one to Sky or Sky Gradient. I usually like to add a gradient that goes from light to dark, and for that we're going to pick a lighter version of the sky color that we use. So in the color palette, it's going to be this one right here. And here, if you've been working with either free Procreate brushes or a different software, you could stick with whichever pencil brush you're using, or you could experiment and try to find a charcoal brush. So whatever has charcoal in the name could probably work. If you're working in Procreate, in the charcoal pack here, the willow charcoal is probably what I would recommend. Otherwise, if you're working with the illustration bundle, you could pick the basic texture brush or the everything brush. Honestly, they would both work really well. I'm gonna go with the basic texture. And with a very big brush, you're just going to paint your gradient. And already you can see that just doing that brings a whole lot more life to the piece. So we're going to keep going and just doing a few gradients. The next one is going to be in the water because, again, we can remember the water essentially reflects the sky. But for the water, since it is a more complex shape, we're going to activate what is called alpha lock. Now, if you're working in Procreate, the way to activate alpha lock is just swiping your layer towards the right with 2 fingers, or you could also just tap on the layer and activate alpha lock from the menu. And with alpha lock activated, now whatever we draw on the water layer is going to stay within the shape that we already have. Now, if your software doesn't have alpha lock, it's really not a big deal. You're just going to need to be a little bit more careful so that you can stay within the water shape. Now, just like we did for the sky here, we're going to pick a lighter version of a watercolor. So if you're working in Procreate, it's going to be this one right here, but otherwise you can color pick and make your color lighter. And same thing, we're just going to brush a gradient, but this time starting from the top of the water and going down towards the front. Now we're going to do the same thing with the sand. So selecting the sand layer, activating alpha lock so it stays within the sand shape, and picking a lighter version of a base sand, which in the color palette is going to be this one right here. And then once more, you can just brush over, starting from the top of the sand, going towards the bottom. We're also going to use the alpha lock technique to add some shadows, and we're going to start by adding some on the clouds so that they blend a little bit less in the sky. So just going on the cloud layer and activating alpha lock, or again, just being a bit more careful when you place your colors. And we're going to go with a darker, but also more blue version of the cloud color that you use. So in the color palette, it's going to be this blue right here. And for the clouds, what you might want to do is just add a bit of a shadow on the bottom section of the different clouds that you have. Now we're also going to add some shadows on the mountains, so just activating alpha lock on the mountains layer this time. And here for the color, I'm actually going to pick the color that I used for the rocks in the front, so just color picking that in the color palette. I think it was this one right here. Yeah, and then just brushing it towards the lower part of the mountains where they connect with the sand or the water. If you want, you could also add a bit of green on your mountains to make it look like there's some grass or something growing on there. So just switching to whatever green you want in the color palette. I think I'm using this one right here. And then still on the mountain layer, still with the same brush, just brushing a bit of green towards the top of the mountains. Now by doing that, we kind of blended the mountains with the palm trees, but that's not a problem because we're also going to add color variation on the palm trees. So just activating alpha lock on the palm tree layers, both of them, and starting with the one with the palm trees in the back. Just picking a darker version of the different colors we used. In the color palette, I think it's this one right here. And then just brushing that over the leaves to help them separate from the mountains. Now for the palm tree in the front, you might actually want to add some highlights instead. So just selecting your front palm tree layer and going in with a lighter version of your green. So in the color palette, this one right here. And this time brushing it towards the top part of your palm tree. We're also going to add some lights on the rocks that are in the front, so just once more activating alpha lock on the rocks layer. Picking a lighter version of the rock color in the color palette, it's this one right here, and once more brushing it towards the top of the rocks. Now we're also going to add a bit of a gradient in the front of the water so it doesn't look like it's just super opaque, it looks like it's transparent, and for that you could go ahead and just paint with your sand color, but I actually like to just erase the water layer itself a little bit so that it starts showing the sand in the front. So for that, just set your eraser to the soft brush from the airbrushing pack, and you might want to lower the opacity of your eraser so it doesn't erase everything all at once. And then with a pretty big brush, you can just kind of go over the edges and erase a little. Now there are only 2 little steps left to do, but they can make a big difference, so make sure you watch until the end. The first one is, if you are working with the illustration bundle, you could add a bit more details in the sand. So to do that, just select your sand layer, select the lightest color you use for your sand and make it even brighter, and pick the freckles brush from the illustration bundle. Now if you're working with free brushes from Procreate or a different software at all, you could mimic this step by just using any brush really and drawing a bunch of dots. But if you do have the freckle brush, it's pretty quick and easy. As you can see, you can just brush and it's going to add a bunch of little grains of sand everywhere. And the very last thing we might want to do is add a bit of a vignette effect to help frame the piece. So we're just going to create a new layer above everything, above the details even, and we're going to rename it to vignette. And we are going to set the blending mode of this vignette layer to linear burn. And by using linear burn, we're going to be able to paint with one color, and that color is going to adapt to what's under it and just make all those colors on the edges darker, essentially creating what is called the vignette effect. And for now, we might want to set the opacity of the vignette layer to 50% or something like that, just so it's not too intense. And here you can really use any color of your choice to create your vignette. The only thing I would recommend is not going with a neutral gray or black, because then you're going to get really muddy colors on the edges. So anything that has a bit of a tint to it, I'm going to go with some sort of a brown just to keep it in warmer colors because I want to keep the warm feel, the beachy vibe. And then with pretty much whichever brush other than the freckles brush, so I'm going to go with just the everything brush, we're going to draw a U shape like this in the bottom. It's more like a half vignette than a full vignette. Then we're going to fill in the shape. And using any kind of blurring tool that you have in your software, most software have something called Gaussian blur. In Procreate, it's in the adjustment panel here at the top. We're just going to blur the vignette so that it blends with the rest of the piece. And then once you have it, you can see mine is way too intense. You can just go back and play with the opacity so that you have a bit of contrast going on, but so it's not super crazy looking either. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn how to draw a cartoon character to put in this background, I highly recommend you check out this playlist because I have a bunch of tutorials for you. But before you leave, make sure to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the weekly videos. Then click on the link right here and I'll meet you there.